In the heart of the Thraxos Empire, Princess Griala has been hidden away, labeled as special by her father, the Emperor, and treated as nothing more than a disappointment. Her size, her appearance, everything about her fails to meet the expectations of royalty. But when a humble human mechanic named Ezra arrives at the royal citadel, he sees something the Empire has overlooked: her true worth. Together, they will challenge the Empire's beliefs and prove that a person's value is defined by much more than what meets the eye. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The royal palace of Thraxos stood tall and cold, its towering spires piercing the violet sky like dark, jagged teeth. Inside, the halls gleamed with opulent marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and gold-drenched pillars. To the Empire, this was a place of grandeur, power, and perfection. To Princess Griala, it was a prison. Griala had spent the majority of her life hidden in the farthest corners of the palace. Her father, the Emperor, expected nothing less than flawless perfection from his heirs. But Griala was far from perfect. Her body, round and heavy, did not conform to the slender beauty standards of the royal family. While the other royal children were celebrated for their grace, Griala was only labeled special, a term that cut deeper than any insult. She was kept away from public eyes, away from the court, where her father's expectations weighed on her like an anchor. Most of the time, Griala embraced her solitude. The palace was vast, yet it felt empty. There were no cheerful conversations, no friends or family to share moments with. The other courtiers and servants passed her by without a second glance, and the Emperor hardly ever visited. To him, Griala was just another duty, his daughter, yes, but one whose flaws were better hidden. Her life felt like a long wait for something that would never come. The world outside, with its glittering lights and the promises of grandeur, seemed so far away. Today, however, something felt different. The hum of the palace's machinery seemed to carry more tension than usual, the air thick with anticipation. There was a subtle change in the rhythm of the palace, an unfamiliar energy. Griala could hear the soft murmurs of servants and officials discussing the arrival of someone new. A human, a mechanic, called in to fix the palace's broken systems. To Griala, the news felt like a distraction, a small interruption in her endless routine. But she had no way of knowing that this human would change her life forever. Ezra, the mechanic, stepped into the palace with nothing more than a simple task at hand: to repair the ancient machinery that kept the royal citadel running. He had no interest in the politics or spectacle of the empire, but as he wandered through the winding halls, something in the air made him uneasy. The palace, though grand, seemed empty and cold, its beauty masking something darker beneath. It felt as though the walls themselves whispered secrets, too many of them too painful to confront. As he passed the grand hall, he saw her, the princess, alone, tucked away in a corner, her face distant and her body hunched under the weight of invisible burdens. When their eyes met, it wasn't the pity or scorn that Griala had grown used to, it was something different. Ezra simply saw her. "Can I help you?" he asked gently, his voice breaking the silence between them. Griala blinked, surprised by the kindness in his voice. For the first time in years, someone didn't look at her as a disgrace. "Maybe you can," she replied softly, almost to herself. Their connection was immediate, and in that moment, Griala knew her life was about to change. Ezra spent the next few days working through the royal citadel, tasked with repairing aging machinery, restoring the worn floors, and fixing broken lights. The palace, grand and intimidating, felt like a labyrinth. Though his work was simple, a growing sense of unease followed him as he moved through its marble halls. It wasn't the technical repairs that troubled him, it was the overwhelming silence. The palace, despite its opulence, felt empty, like it was holding its breath. He soon became aware of Princess Griala, though not directly. Her presence was subtle, hidden from the public eye, but always felt. He would catch glimpses of her silhouetted in the distance, her figure framed by the palace's towering doors. She never engaged with anyone, but her eyes would linger on him, watching from afar. Ezra didn't find this strange. She seemed to live in the same world he did, the invisible one. There were whispers in the halls about her. Some spoke with sympathy, others with disdain. Her size, her manner, none of it fit the royal image. She was a figure to be pitied, ignored, or tucked away. But Ezra didn't look at her that way. He saw someone who was, like him, a forgotten part of the palace, always overlooked. One evening, as he worked late, Ezra passed by the grand entry to the royal chambers. Griala stood just within the shadow of the doors, her face barely visible, but her eyes watching him. She didn't move as he approached. It was a strange kind of silence between them, one that felt like they both understood the unspoken boundaries of their worlds. "Princess," Ezra said gently, his voice breaking through the stillness. She flinched at the sound of his voice, clearly startled. Slowly, she stepped forward into the faint light. Her gaze met his, cautious but curious. Ezra paused for a moment before speaking again. "You don't have to hide here." Griala didn't respond, but there was something in her eyes, something that flickered for the briefest moment, a desire to step out from behind her walls. She had spent so many years isolated in the palace, only called special by her father, as though it were a curse, not a gift. "Everyone here, they don't see you," Ezra continued. "But I do." She swallowed hard, her expression softening. "No one's ever said that before." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ezra nodded, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to be what they want you to be." For the first time in years, Griala felt a shift, a crack in the shell she had built to protect herself. It wasn't much, but in that fleeting moment, something changed. Ezra had seen her, truly seen her, and that was enough to start the long journey ahead. Days passed, and the quiet connection between Ezra and Griala grew stronger, though neither spoke of it. The palace was a sprawling maze, its halls full of echoing whispers and looming shadows. Ezra continued his repairs, but now there was a subtle, constant pull in the air, a tension he couldn't ignore. The moment he had shared with Griala haunted him, and his thoughts often drifted to her, how alone she must feel in this towering, unfeeling place. One evening, as the last light of the sun faded beyond the palace walls, Ezra found himself working late, alone in a forgotten corridor. The dust motes danced in the dying light, and the hum of the palace's machinery was the only sound. As he tightened a bolt in one of the many ancient pipes, he heard soft footsteps behind him. His heart skipped a beat. Turning, he saw Griala standing at the end of the hall, hesitating. Her usual quiet was replaced with a hint of uncertainty, and for the first time, she wasn't hiding in the shadows. The princess, once cloaked in isolation, now stood before him, her gaze steady, but her hands ringing nervously. "Ezra," she said, her voice low. I wanted to thank you." The words were simple, but there was something in her tone, something fragile, that made Ezra stop what he was doing. She had never sought his attention, never asked for anything before. She was always the quiet observer, hiding in plain sight. But now, she was reaching out. He smiled softly, brushing his hands on his pants. "You don't need to thank me." But Griala shook her head, stepping closer. "I do. You've made me feel seen. I didn't think anyone here could." Ezra took a step toward her, his heart racing. "I don't understand," he said. "Why do they treat you like this?" She looked down, the weight of her past hanging heavy in her eyes. "Because I don't fit what they expect of me. I don't look like a royal. I don't act like one either." Her voice trembled slightly. "My father, the emperor, he calls me special, but I know it's just a nicer word for failure." Ezra reached out, hesitant, and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but the warmth of it seemed to ground her. He could feel the tension in her body, the years of loneliness she carried. And yet, as she stood there, with his hand on her, she was no longer the isolated princess in the shadows. "You are not a failure," Ezra said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You're not special because you're different. You're special because of who you are. You just have to see it too." Griala looked up at him, the faintest spark of hope in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her isolation lift, if only slightly. And in that moment, everything changed, no longer just a mechanic and a princess, but two people connected by a quiet understanding. As the days blurred into one another, Ezra continued his work in the palace, but his attention now split between his tasks and the quiet moments he shared with Griala. The more time they spent together, the more Ezra realized how deeply misunderstood she was. Her life, dictated by royal expectations and her father's cold judgments, had left her fractured, unable to see her own worth. She had been hidden away for so long that even the palace itself seemed to forget her presence. Griala, however, was beginning to change. Each conversation, each moment of quiet support from Ezra, planted a seed of something new, something she had never allowed herself to believe: hope. She had always been told she was the emperor's special daughter, treated as an outsider in her own palace. But Ezra saw her, truly saw her, not as a royal figure to be polished and perfected, but as a person with her own potential. It was late one evening when Griala appeared in the workshop again, the familiar silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. She had not asked for this meeting, yet here she stood, closer than before. She looked different, stronger, in a way that Ezra couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the new light in her eyes or the change in her posture. She wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. "I've been thinking," Griala began, her voice steady but soft, "about what you said the other day, about not having to be what they want me to be." Ezra looked up from his work, his heart beating faster at her words. "And," she took a deep breath, stepping closer to the workbench, "I've always felt like I didn't belong here, like I didn't fit the mold of a princess. But maybe that's not so bad. Maybe I'm not meant to be the kind of royal they expect. Maybe I'm meant for something else." The weight of her words hung in the air. Ezra set down the wrench he was holding, his full attention now on her. "What do you mean?" Griala paused, as if weighing her own thoughts. "I don't want to be the forgotten daughter. I don't want to hide away, hidden from the world, just to make everyone else comfortable. I want to do something more, something real. I want to stop being the special one they look at with pity. I want to be someone who matters, not because of my blood, but because of what I can do." Ezra felt a surge of admiration for her, how brave she was, how willing to face the truth of her own pain and desire for change. "You already matter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I understand. You don't have to be anyone's idea of a princess. You just have to be you." A small smile tugged at the corner of Griala's lips. "Maybe that's the first step towards something different." Ezra nodded. It was a quiet revolution, one without grand speeches or rebellion, just two people willing to step into the light and embrace their true selves. And for the first time in her life, Griala felt like she had a choice in the matter. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to spark the change she had been waiting for. The following week, a royal decree echoed through the palace. The emperor, in one of his rare public declarations, had summoned Griala. His command was simple, but it weighed heavily on the princess's heart. She was to appear before the court at the grand banquet, a spectacle of the highest order. Her presence, as always, would be an announcement of her special status, something to be flaunted before the other nobles. The news struck Griala like a thunderclap, bringing her world to a standstill. She had known this day would come, the moment when her father would demand her appearance once more. Every time she stepped into the court, she felt the same crushing pressure to conform, to smile, to behave as if she were worthy of the title she had been given. But it always felt like a lie. To be displayed like a prize, to be called special again and again. Knowing what it really meant, it broke her a little more each time. Ezra, who had been quietly working in the background, noticed the shift in Griala's demeanor. When he saw her pacing the halls of the palace, her shoulders tense, her steps hurried, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't the usual quiet sadness he had grown used to seeing in her. This time, there was something different in the air. Griala had been called. He approached her carefully, stepping into the hallway where she stood alone, her gaze distant. "Princess," he said softly, trying not to startle her. She turned slowly, her expression blank, but Ezra could see the anxiety hidden just beneath the surface. "They're making me go," she whispered, her voice barely above a tremor. "Father, he wants me to be the showpiece again, to stand there while they look at me, judge me. He doesn't even see me. I'm just special." Ezra's heart clenched at her words. He had seen her struggle with her role in the palace. But now, it felt different. This time, there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't going to let this define her, not anymore. "You don't have to do it alone," Ezra said, his voice firm. "I'm here, and I believe in you, Griala. They want to see you as special. Show them who you really are. You're not some prize to be paraded. You're more than that." "And?" Griala blinked, surprise flickering across her face. You really believe that?" Ezra nodded, taking a step closer. "I don't just believe it, I know it." For a long moment, Griala stood silently, her breath slow and steady. The weight of her father's expectations hung heavily around her, but for the first time, it didn't feel as suffocating. Ezra's words, his belief in her, cut through the fog of doubt. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be what the Emperor demanded. She could be more. "I won't be their special daughter anymore," Griala said, her voice steady. "I'll be me." And for the first time, Griala felt the stirrings of something more than rebellion. It was freedom. The grand banquet arrived sooner than Griala had anticipated, and with it came the heavy expectation of her public appearance. As she prepared in her chambers, the weight of her father's decree hung over her like a storm cloud, yet something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt like the timid, invisible daughter forced to play a role. The quiet encouragement from Ezra had planted a seed of defiance, something that would soon grow beyond the confines of the palace. Griala stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, the royal gown shimmering under the soft light, but it felt wrong. It was too tight, too restrictive, a constant reminder of the role she was expected to play. She hated how it clung to her body, as though it was trying to squeeze her into a shape she didn't recognize. But today, she refused to let it define her. As the evening approached, Griala's heart pounded in her chest. She was to be presented before the court in a display of her strength, an ancient tradition where the royal heirs were tasked with demonstrating their physical prowess, proving their worth through feats of endurance. Her father had made it clear. She would either meet the challenge or be humiliated in front of the entire empire. Griala knew she wasn't physically like the other heirs. She wasn't built for these competitions, and her father's expectations were nothing more than a cruel reminder of how out of place she was. But she had no choice. The moment arrived. Griala stepped into the grand hall, her every step a battle against the anxious tremors in her limbs. The court was in full attendance, their eyes scanning her as she walked through the massive doors. The Emperor, seated on his throne at the highest tier, watched her with cold, calculating eyes. His gaze felt like an iron weight pressing down on her shoulders. The challenge was simple. Lift a massive stone slab from the floor and hold it above her head for a count of 10. It was an impossible feat for her, but her father had insisted she attempt it. Griala walked to the center of the hall, her body stiff but determined. The stone slab, large and heavy, was placed in front of her. As she knelt to lift it, she felt the eyes of the court bearing down on her, their whispers like daggers. She gripped the slab with both hands, straining against the weight. Her muscles trembled, sweat beading on her forehead, but she held firm. She wasn't going to break. Not this time. With all her strength, she managed to lift the stone just inches from the ground, but it wasn't enough. The court erupted in murmurs of disappointment, and Griala's heart sank. But just as she was about to drop the stone, Ezra's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't have to be what they want you to be." In that moment, Griala found something inside herself she hadn't known was there. She wasn't a failure for not lifting the stone. She was stronger than she had ever realized. She stood tall, refusing to bow under the weight of their judgment. The stone may have fallen, but Griala's resolve had not. The grand hall buzzed with discontent, the murmurs of the court rippling through the air like an electric current. Griala's failure to lift the stone had been a spectacle, one that the Emperor had expected to be humiliating, but to her surprise, it had ignited something deeper. She hadn't broken under the weight of their expectations, and though the court had dismissed her, Ezra's words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to be what they want you to be." It was a quiet rebellion, one that Griala hadn't consciously planned. She had always been the obedient daughter, hiding in plain sight, never daring to challenge her father. But in the wake of the challenge, she felt something stir within her, an understanding that she wasn't bound by the expectations others had placed on her. Ezra had seen it. And now, in the midst of her failure, Griala realized she had seen it too. The truth that had been buried deep inside her was no longer hidden in shadows. She wasn't just the special daughter of the Emperor, she was Griala, a person in her own right, with desires, strengths, and a future she could choose. The next few days were quieter, but the weight of the Emperor's disappointment was always there, looming over her like a storm cloud. But she could feel a shift that Ezra had ignited. His unwavering belief in her, despite everything, made her feel as though she wasn't alone. One evening, as she wandered the palace gardens, Griala found herself once again seeking solitude. The quiet hum of the palace only broken by the distant sounds of music and laughter from the court. Her thoughts were clouded, but then she saw him, Ezra, working on one of the palace's old maintenance systems, his hands stained with grease and sweat. His presence was like a balm to her troubled mind. He looked up when he noticed her standing nearby, offering a smile that was gentle but filled with unspoken understanding. "Griala," he greeted her softly. She walked toward him, feeling the weight of her father's command pressing down on her again. But Ezra's steady gaze seemed to offer a place of refuge. "Ezra, I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't be the Emperor's puppet, performing for his amusement." Ezra set his tools down, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't have to be," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that made Griala's heart skip a beat. "Not anymore. You have the power to choose who you want to be." Griala took a deep breath, the truth of his words sinking in. She had spent her life hidden in plain sight, pushed into a role she didn't want. But now, standing before Ezra, she realized she could finally step into her own light. The forbidden alliance between them had begun in secret, but the truth was undeniable. Together, they could change everything. Griala's refusal to conform had rippled through the palace like a stone thrown into still water, disturbing the carefully curated peace her father had worked so hard to maintain. The Emperor's anger simmered just beneath the surface, and Griala knew that it was only a matter of time before he would make her pay for her defiance. The days following the banquet were heavy with tension. The court had returned to its normal rhythm, but it was different now. The whispers were louder, the judgment sharper. Griala could feel the eyes of the courtiers on her whenever she passed by. The subtle glances, the hushed conversations, they all revolved around the same thing: her failure. But the more she felt their judgment, the more resolute she became in her decision to break free. She wasn't going to be their pawn anymore. It was late one evening when Griala found herself in the royal gardens, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she walked alone. She needed space, a moment to breathe, away from the suffocating expectations of the court. As she wandered through the labyrinth of plants and statues, her thoughts turned to her father's ultimatum. He had given her a choice. Either she would behave and conform, or she would be cast aside completely. A sense of dread crept in, but it was quickly replaced by something else: anger. Griala had been too quiet for too long, too obedient. She had let her father's words define her, let his expectations shape her life. No more. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, soft yet deliberate. She turned to see Ezra, his face serious but gentle. He had been her constant in a world of uncertainty, the one person who had never treated her like an object or a pawn. "You're out here again," Ezra said, his tone filled with concern. Griala nodded, her throat tight. "I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending," she admitted. "I'm not the perfect princess they want me to be. I'm not even close." Ezra stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to pretend. You don't have to be perfect for them. You don't have to be anything for them." His words were like a lifeline, something Griala had needed to hear but had never allowed herself to believe. In that moment, she realized just how much she had been holding back. The years of repression, of hiding who she was. Ezra was the only person who had ever truly seen her for who she was, not who they wanted her to be. The storm inside her was building, a fire of frustration, anger, and yearning for freedom. I can't go back to being what they want. I won't. Ezra took her hand, his touch grounding her. Then don't. Together, we'll figure this out. For the first time in her life, Griala felt truly seen, truly understood. And in that moment, with the weight of the Emperor's empire pressing down on her, she knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but it was hers to choose. The tension between Griala and her father reached a boiling point in the days that followed. The Emperor had never been one to tolerate defiance, especially not from his own blood. Griala could feel his anger festering like an open wound, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he took action. But now, more than ever, she was ready to face whatever came next. Ezra had been her constant support, the one person who didn't see her as a special burden or a failed royal. He saw her strength, her intelligence, her worth. In him, she had found something she never thought possible: a friend, an ally, and someone who believed in her when no one else did. One night, as the palace slept beneath the weight of the Emperor's looming presence, Griala sat by her window, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The stars hung low in the sky, their light casting an ethereal glow across the palace grounds. It was in this quiet moment that Griala knew what she had to do. She could no longer stay hidden in the shadows. She had to break free from the chains her father had shackled her with, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She turned to find Ezra standing in the doorway of her chamber, his presence as comforting as it had ever been. He knew the storm was coming. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had ignited in the garden when she had first started to believe in herself. "Ezra," she said, her voice firm but laced with uncertainty. "I need to leave. I can't stay here anymore under his control. I need to find my own way." Ezra nodded without hesitation. "I'll help you," he said simply. She wasn't surprised by his answer. Ezra had always been there when she needed him, even when she hadn't known she needed him. The trust between them was deep and undeniable. But as the weight of her decision settled over her, Griala felt a wave of fear wash over her. Leaving the palace meant defying everything she had known. It meant walking away from her father's empire, from the royal bloodline, and from the life she had been forced into. But it also meant freedom. "I'm scared," Griala confessed, her voice breaking for the first time. "I don't know what's out there. What if I fail?" Ezra crossed the room and knelt beside her, looking her in the eye. "You've already succeeded, Griala. You've already found the courage to see yourself for who you truly are. That's the hardest part." For a long moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. But for the first time, Griala wasn't afraid. She was ready. With Ezra by her side, she would break the chains of her past and walk into a future of her own making. The palace, the Emperor, and everything that had once held her captive were no longer her prison. It was time to step into the unknown, and it was time to live for herself. Griala's decision to leave the palace was not one she had taken lightly, but it was the only choice that made sense. With Ezra by her side, she was no longer afraid of the Emperor's wrath or the judgment of the court. As the days passed, the plan to escape grew more tangible, its outlines clear in her mind. Yet, the closer they came to carrying it out, the more the weight of what she was about to lose settled in her chest. She was leaving everything behind, the only life she had ever known. The night they had chosen for her escape was heavy with anticipation, the palace thick with the usual hum of wealth and power. But for Griala, it felt like a funeral procession. She had been born into this world of royalty, but the chains that bound her had become too tight to bear. The question now was whether she could truly leave it behind without looking back. That night, as the palace slept, Griala moved through the halls with Ezra, both of them knowing what lay ahead. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding. No words were necessary. Griala, in her gown, once a symbol of her royal status, now felt like a costume she was shedding. With each step toward the exit, she felt a piece of the past fall away. They reached the outer gates of the palace, where the last line of defense was the imperial guards, armed, vigilant, and loyal to the emperor. Griala hesitated for only a moment. She had spent her life under their watchful eyes, under the emperor's expectations. Now, standing at the threshold of freedom, she was ready to face whatever came next. Ezra motioned toward the guard post, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I know a way through," he said quietly. They had planned for this, meticulously ensuring there were no obstacles in their path. The guards, ever diligent, wouldn't be expecting a princess to flee, and that was their advantage. With swift, careful movements, they crept past the guards, using shadows as their allies. The palace loomed behind them, a silent giant in the dark. Griala's heart beat in her chest. Each step she took away from it feeling like a victory, yet also a loss. As they neared the palace gates, Griala could hear the distant sounds of the court celebrating, unaware of her absence. They were carrying on as if everything was the same, but she knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. As Ezra helped her slip through the final barrier, Griala felt the last thread of her old life snap. She was free. For the first time in years, Griala took a deep breath, one not shaped by fear or expectation. She wasn't the Emperor's special daughter anymore. She was Griala, a person with the power to choose her path, and she was ready to walk it. The world outside the palace walls was nothing like Griala had imagined. It was harsher, wilder, and full of uncertainty. For the first time in her life, she was free, but freedom came with a price. With every step, she felt the weight of her decision press harder on her shoulders. She had left behind the only life she knew, the only world that had shaped her existence. Now, the unknown stretched out before her, and she couldn't help but feel vulnerable. Ezra, ever the calm presence beside her, didn't show any fear. He had walked this road before, and though it was new for Griala, he didn't hesitate. He had believed in her from the start, and that belief made all the difference. They traveled by foot, moving through the wilderness on the outskirts of the empire, careful to stay hidden from the eyes of the Emperor's forces. Griala had no illusions about the consequences of her flight. Her father would not let this go. The Emperor would stop at nothing to bring her back, to restore his control over her. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't running away from something, she was running towards something. She was running toward the future she could create, not one imposed upon her by the weight of royal expectation. As they journeyed further, Griala began to feel the stirrings of something she hadn't known in years' hope. It was a quiet thing at first, just a whisper beneath the fear and uncertainty. But as she walked alongside Ezra, as they shared their journey, that hope began to grow stronger. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. One evening, as they camped by a small stream, Griala looked at Ezra, her heart full of emotions she didn't quite know how to express. "I never thought it would be like this," she admitted, her voice soft in the cool night air. "I thought leaving the palace would be the hardest thing, but now I'm beginning to see that the real challenge is what comes next. What if I fail?" Ezra, sitting across from her, gave a soft chuckle. "You've already faced the hardest part, Griala. You've broken free from the chains that held you. What comes next is just the beginning." She looked at him, and for the first time, she truly saw the depth of their bond. Ezra wasn't just a mechanic who had helped her fix the broken parts of the palace. He had helped her fix herself. And now, as they stood on the precipice of something new, she knew she wasn't alone. "We don't have to know what's ahead," Ezra continued, his eyes steady. "All we need is the courage to keep moving forward." Griala smiled, the weight on her chest lifting just a little. "Then let's keep moving forward." And so they did together, into the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, Griala was ready. The true test wasn't in how far she had come, but in how far she was willing to go. And with Ezra by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Griala had never imagined that life outside the palace walls would be so difficult. Days turned into weeks, and though they moved swiftly through the rugged landscapes, every step away from the empire was a constant reminder of the weight of her decision. The world beyond the royal citadel was unforgiving, filled with challenges that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. The peace of the palace, with its predictability and structure, now seemed like a distant memory. But with every hardship, she grew stronger. The girl who had once hidden in the shadows of her father's expectations was slowly transforming into someone new, a woman who could face the world head-on, not as the Emperor's daughter, but as Griala. Ezra was there every step of the way, guiding her, encouraging her when the doubt crept in. The alliance between them had blossomed into something deeper, something neither had expected. One night, as they camped under a blanket of stars, Griala sat quietly, watching the flickering firelight dance across the rocks. The crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the night air. She had grown accustomed to this being out here in the wilds, away from the grand palace and its suffocating beauty. Yet even as she began to embrace this new life, the fear lingered in her heart. What if she had made the wrong choice? What if the empire was all she had ever known, and she couldn't truly live outside of it? Ezra broke the silence, his voice steady. "You're thinking too much. It's not about where you came from, it's about who you are now." Griala turned to face him. His eyes were soft, but filled with certainty, as if he knew the struggles she was facing even without her saying a word. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next," she confessed. "I don't know what this new life means." "You don't have to have all the answers," Ezra replied. "What matters is that you're choosing for yourself. That's more than most people ever get." The words settled in Griala's heart like a truth she had always known, but had been too afraid to accept. She had been living for others her whole life, her father's expectations, the court's judgment. But now, for the first time, she was living for herself. And though the future was uncertain, that was enough to carry her forward. As the firelight flickered, Griala looked out at the horizon. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking toward something new, toward the future she could create with her own hands, her own choices. And though she didn't yet know what lay ahead, she knew one thing for sure. She was free. "Tomorrow we keep moving," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. Ezra smiled. "Yes, we do." And together, they stepped into the future, knowing that it was theirs to shape. Days turned into weeks, and the journey continued. Griala and Ezra moved further from the empire, deeper into the unknown. They passed through wild forests, crossed rivers, and climbed jagged mountains, always staying one step ahead of the Emperor's forces. But even in the vastness of the wilderness, Griala felt something she had never known: freedom. She had shed the weight of her past, the expectations that had once defined her. And though the road was difficult, it was hers to walk. There were moments, of course, when fear crept in. The world outside the palace wasn't kind to those who had nothing but the clothes on their back. But every time doubt entered Griala's mind, she thought of Ezra. He had been her rock, her constant guide through this new world. His belief in her never wavered, even when her own faltered. One evening, as they sat beside a fire, Griala gazed at the stars above. They were far from the palace now, but she still sometimes felt the weight of her old life pressing on her. It was a quiet night, the world around them still and peaceful. But Griala's mind was restless. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the silence. "What if the Emperor catches up with us? What if we can't outrun him?" Ezra, as always, looked at her with quiet understanding. "You've already outrun the most important thing, the fear. The fear that made you stay in that palace, pretending to be something you weren't. That's the hardest part. No one can take that from you now." Griala smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. I've spent my whole life being told what to be, what to do. I don't know how to make my own path." Ezra leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're already doing it. Every step you take is a choice, and every choice you make is a step toward who you want to become. That's how we find our way." Griala nodded slowly, the weight in her chest lifting a little. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was in control of her own destiny. The chains that had once bound her were gone, and she was free to choose what came next. The next morning, they continued their journey, walking into the unknown together. There would be challenges ahead, and the shadows of her past would not easily fade. But with each new day, Griala felt stronger. She was no longer just the Emperor's daughter. She was Griala, a woman with her own choices, her own power, and her own future. And for the first time, Griala believed that anything was possible.